Aristotle builds his ethics from his concepts of human nature and eudaimonia. For Aristotle, we fulfill our human function when we have cultivated virtuous characters and can reliably and more easily do our human activities well. A virtue, simply put, is an excellent or good state or disposition for activity. It's a characteristic of your person. Aristotle would use the word soul, that a virtue is an excellent disposition or characteristic of your soul. The broadest definition of virtue is a capacity for excellent activity. And we now tend to use this word virtue only when we want to imply moral excellence, but for Aristotle and Greek philosophers generally, he was talking about general excellence. He would call a virtue any capacity we have that has been developed or cultivated into an excellent state. Intellectual virtues, primarily, are characteristics concerning theoretical understanding, subject matters that are fairly abstracted from our particular existence. Metaphysics, mathematics, logic, physics, astronomy, linguistics, etc. Think of these as areas of knowledge or understanding where particular knowledge and examples they serve the more abstract knowledge. For example, particular triangles or diagrams serve the purpose of understanding more universal truths of mathematics. So we learn intellectual virtues through teaching, according to Aristotle. And you can think of this as just that you can learn this kind of knowledge by sitting at your desk, reading, thinking, talking, writing, repeat. Moral virtues, primarily, are characteristics concerning action and emotion. Being able to feel the right emotions at the right time and towards the right things, and knowing the right or best action in a given situation. So in moral virtue, a person needs a kind of keen perceptual sensitivity to situational factors, because those factors will be the cues and triggers for emotions and actions. Think of these as dispositions for using more universal or abstract knowledge to serve the purpose of particular knowledge. For instance, the particular action to take, the particular emotion to feel. We'll get into how we learn the right emotions to feel in a bit, but it has to do with this idea here of learning by doing. We learn moral virtues by doing, right? This is what Aristotle says. And you know, he really does mean practice. Very straightforward notion that you have to practice being good in order to be good. So just like it takes practice to be excellent at carpentry, it'll take practice to be excellent at moral action. Because they have to do with a disposition for consistent behaviors, moral virtues are habits. The key differences between intellectual and moral virtues are that moral virtue is an imprecise subject matter. Specific rules for action cannot be determined ahead of time. That's what that means. And additionally, that moral virtue must be learned by doing, learned through action. And these two features turn out to be the central features of Aristotle's ethics. And from them, he theorizes the doctrine of the mean. So the rest of this PowerPoint and these videos will cover these features of Aristotle's moral theory, as well as his theory of the golden mean. These features being the imprecise subject matter of ethics, and that moral virtue must be learned by doing. Moral development occurs through habituation. Aristotle tells us that the virtues we acquire by first having put them into action. Now, the process of habituation in Aristotle's philosophy is the process of moving from a potential state to an actual state. And actually, I think that that's a fine way to define habituation more generally. But the idea here is that prior to habituating a habit for a certain kind of action, you merely have the potential to have that action. And then after, you merely have the potential to have the habit for that action. Let's take the habit of running, yeah, daily. So we all have the potential to be runners, more or less. Um, some of us may require different kinds of strategies, different kinds of equipment, different kinds of assisting, you know, uh, wraps or prosthetics or shoes or what have you. Um, but we all have the potential to be runners. We have what's called a potential state for running, and through the process of habituation, we actualize that state because each instance of practice, we are uh, actively working on our disposition for running, not just actually running. By nature, but so as far as ethics, then this is about moving from habituating our way from a potential state toward a potential state of courage or generosity to an actual state of courage or generosity. And every specific action that we take in our practice of developing a generous disposition is work on actualizing a state of generousness as well as being generous in the moment. By nature, for Aristotle, we are born neither with the virtues nor born contrary to them. So for Aristotle, when it comes to moral virtue, we're born blank. It is not innate in us in any real way, like it is in Mencius's theory, but it is by no means contrary to our nature. So rather, we are born with the potential to be virtuous, and habituation completes or fulfills this potential. So one learns ethics via habituation for Aristotle. Our parents plus the state compose the context of habituation. This is a part of what Aristotle means by saying that certain conditions must be met in order for us to be happy. We can only be happy if we succeed at cultivating our rational and social capacities. But in order to do that, we need to be born into a context where we have good teachers and the freedom to do so, the freedom to cultivate good habits. Moral virtue is a huge part of happiness, Aristotle argues. But we have to habituate moral virtue, which means we're going to be very dependent on others, adults when we're young, and those in power when we are not, in order to maintain the environment where the development of these parts of ourselves is possible. Recall from chapter 2 of book 2, Aristotle makes an analogy to art and craftsmanship. And let's remember the idea being when talking about art or developing a craft, practice will indeed be required to get to the level of expert. But when it comes to our dependency on others, we also see this in the realm of, or we should say, we also do see the role or our dependence of others in the analogy for art or craftsmanship. Aristotle says, right, if we didn't need others in our development of these excellent skills, there would be no need for an instructor, but everybody would be born, good or bad, at some craft. But that's not the case. That's not what we observe, right? Everybody has to practice your craft. Nobody is born being a good house builder or being a good cross stitcher. We need to be taught how to do these things. We need others to help us develop those skills. And the same is true for moral virtue. So it is in this way that ethics is political for Aristotle. Our legislatures must be practically wise people in order to make the best city. And in Aristotle's political theory, the ruling state, or I should say, ruling the state or being a ruler of a state needs to include a call to serve those less fortunate. And additionally, in chapter 2, Aristotle says, quote, "It is by action that some become just and others unjust. It is by acting in the face of danger and by developing the habit of feeling fear and confidence that some become brave and others cowards." I just wanted to include that quote to reiterate the role of actually doing the kinds of actions that one wants to do from a place of habit. And then we get in chapter 2 also a really good example um, of well, we get a good example through his discussion of strength in terms of what he means by having to practice moral virtue. Is demonstrated in his comments on strength. Aristotle says, quote, "Strength is produced by consuming plenty of food and by enduring much hard work, and it is the strong man who is best able to do these things." Right? So if you think, say you have the goal of bulking, right? What is it that you're doing when you're trying to get huge? Well, you're trying to be in a state of being huge. The very things that you undertake while practicing towards that end goal are the exact same things that you want to be doing well, easily, and reliably in the end. Right? So, in order to get strong, you got to eat a bunch of food, you got to pick up a bunch of heavy stuff. And then, when you get to be strong, guess what? You're still going to eat a bunch of food, you're still going to pick up a bunch of heavy stuff. But now, it's not as hard, and you can do it you can do it without having to come up with a plan to like get it in your routine. You no longer require the same kinds of training wheels in the building up to it, etc., etc. Additionally, for Aristotle, I'll say it this way. Additionally, I want to make some comments on the relationship between this kind of theoretical knowledge on the one hand and the sort of practical knowledge learned through practice or habituation, as relevant to moral virtue and certain other skills or crafts. For Aristotle, moral virtue works like craftsmanship, medical expertise, and navigation. The expert is one who knows both the principles or universals. You can think of these as like the rules that govern or organize their domain expertise. The expert also needs to know how to anticipate their use or application in the uncountable various ways that these principles show up in practical application of one's knowledge. Whew. The latter, right, being able to apply principles to concrete contexts, requires training, practice, and learning from doing. So take, for example, a surgeon. They must know textbook anatomy and be able to adapt to the unique and sometimes surprising ways individual bodies are presented. Knowing only anatomy in the academic sense would make one a terrible surgeon. Nobody wants that person performing surgery on them because they don't really know what they need to know to be a good surgeon, namely how the principles apply in situations. The virtuous mean in ethics is a character trait or disposition developed by habituating the tendency to act in the morally right way. So performing the right actions feed back into developing the habit to perform those right actions in the future. And the virtuous mean is always in between two extremes, which are vices. We'll get into that in the next slide. So a characteristic is just the displayed behavior associated with a certain emotion. For example, hot-headedness or being a hothead names the tendency to behave a certain way when angry, or a tendency to become angry quickly. We will call that characteristic a virtue when the displayed behavior is morally excellent and appropriate and aligns with the ideal action type that the emotion or the context call for. So for example, the virtue of patience or being patient names the tendency to not be quick to anger, or specifically, patience names the virtuous characteristic of not getting angry or upset at various kinds of obstacles that one can't control or that will not be overcome by getting angry and upset.